Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Across Asia, policymakers and business leaders are once again trying to make sense of a tariff whiplash. This time, after the Supreme Court ruled President Donald Trump's signature tariff strategy illegal.
A top official in Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party called the tariff situation a real mess, while sources say Indian officials are postponing talks to finalize New Delhi's pact with the U.S.
Much of the confusion comes from Trump's workaround response to the Supreme Court ruling and his threats to impose fresh tariffs on trading partners. He announced a temporary 10% global tariff that went into effect Tuesday and said he plans to raise it to 15%. Trump's also getting ready to launch a series of investigations that could pile on even more import duties. Some are tied to national security. Others are connected to Section 301 of a trade act. They could allow the U.S. to impose retaliatory levies on countries carrying out unreasonable or discriminatory actions against American trade.
The president is sending out a series of warnings today via Truth Social about any country that doubts his ability to impose tariffs in this fashion. He said any country that wants to play games with the ridiculous Supreme Court decision, buyer beware.
After Trump announced his Liberation Day tariffs almost a year ago, countries in Asia raced to negotiate trade deals with the U.S. Now they're wondering if they're going to have to renegotiate. And this time around, many are finding they're in a much better position.
President Trump, by most accounts, has lost a lot of leverage here.
Brendan Murray oversees Bloomberg's trade coverage from London.
And if you're sitting in Brussels or Beijing right now, you're saying perhaps maybe we have more leverage than we did last week, so maybe we could think about retaliating. Maybe this is where the countries look at what President Trump has lost and they say, you know, we're not going to put up with that, and we do have ways to fight back.
One of the countries that stands to win big out of all of this, China.
If you're Beijing, you're sort of now on a level playing field with U.S. allies.
Jenni Marsh oversees Bloomberg's coverage of North Asia's economy and politics.
You've gone from the biggest target when Trump first came in to now sort of, you have a fairly level playing ground.
She says the Supreme Court's decision shifts the power dynamics ahead of an important summit between President Trump and President Xi Jinping next month. So what was achieved?
By the trade war?
Yeah.
What was achieved? I think China realized it's not half as dependent on America as everyone thought.
This is the Big Take Asia from Bloomberg News. I'm Oanh Ha. Every week, we take you inside some of the world's biggest and most powerful economies and the markets, tycoons, and businesses that drive this ever-shifting region. Today on the show, a legal blow in Washington, D.C. just added more trade uncertainty, how the Supreme Court tariff ruling is playing out in Asia, and the surprise advantage it could give to Beijing. Thank you so much, both of you, for making time to join us. Between the three of us, we've got big parts of the world covered. Brendan, you're based in London. Jenni, you're here with me in Hong Kong. Before we get into what this ruling means for countries and manufacturers, I have to ask, what's been the reaction to the Supreme Court ruling on the ground where you are?
I think a lot of people have more questions right now than they do answers. President Trump came out pretty assertively after the Supreme Court ruled against him and said, in effect, nothing's changed. I still have tariff authorities, and I may even use them to a greater degree than I did before. The story is the same. The U.S. is going to use tariffs to try to reshore manufacturing, create factory jobs, and essentially, as President Trump would say, rebalance the global trading system back in the U.S.'s favor.
That's interesting. So he's trying to say nothing's changed here.
Yeah, nothing's changed, but, in a sense, a lot of things have changed. President Trump, by most accounts, has lost a lot of leverage here.
Jenni, what about here in Hong Kong and broadly in China? What's been the reaction?
It's been pretty muted and measured, I would say. But also, when you sort of look at this, China sort of came out from the ruling as one of the winners. So, in a way, it's hard for them to sort of come out sort of threatening anything because they've probably benefited from the Supreme Court ruling. I think, particularly ahead of the Xi-Trump summit as well, they have to be thinking this sort of weakens Trump's hand just a couple of weeks before he flies into Beijing. I think that being said, China realizes there still is a Section 301 investigation pending against them. So in that sense, they're actually weaker than other countries, and that this sort of investigation has already sort of been in train for months. That could be expedited now, so they could quickly see more tariffs. And those tariffs under that investigation have no upper limit, and they're pretty sticky. The ones imposed under Section 301 from Trump's first term are still in place. So I think that probably also is why they're sort of waiting and seeing before coming out with a sort of a strong reaction. And then I think for exporters in this region, particularly sort of ones that had the China Plus One strategies, for them, I think there's a big question mark now over, was it a good idea to invest in new factories in Cambodia and Vietnam? Is it as useful as I thought it was going to be?
Jenni, who are the winners in this, and what does this victory mean for them?
The biggest winners so far is China, India, and Brazil. They were facing the highest tariffs, and they're the ones that have seen the biggest sort of percentage point decreases. But I think everyone's aware that this is just the holding pattern, right? This is what Trump has done as sort of to bridge the gap until he can sort of then use his other tools to get tariffs really where he wants them. And it's going to be much more complicated and harder for business to navigate, because rather than looking at sort of broad tariffs, it's going to be this sort of like jumble of different sort of sectorial tariffs. So Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, the big thing they are looking at still now is a Section 232 investigation into chips. And for Taiwan, actually, that was always the case, because the trade deal they struck had a carve-out for chips, which is sort of the biggest thing they export to the US. So in some respects, it was always going to be around these specific investigations into sort of really contentious sectors. And I think that hasn't really changed. So even though it's sort of a headline win in some of these ways for some of these countries, there are sort of more potent measures down the pipeline.
And it seems like countries like Japan and South Korea that had negotiated a 15% tariff rate, it looks like they've now just also lost their competitive advantage as well, right? If everyone else gets 15%.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're these trade negotiators and you spent like the last year painstakingly having these meetings and sort of working out these deals, convincing your companies to get behind you, it must be so frustrating to wake up and to sort of realize that hard work has sort of been for nothing. At the same time, it makes it harder for Japan, South Korea to sort of say that their trade deals are invalid, because the tariffs are actually where they negotiated them to be at. So in a way, it's kind of status quo for them.
After the break, how the tariff drama of the past year has remapped global trade, and how the Supreme Court ruling could play to Xi Jinping's advantage at a high-stakes summit next month. I'm back with Brendan Murray, who runs Bloomberg's trade coverage, and Jenni Marsh, who oversees North Asia's economy and politics. Regardless of how President Trump responds to the upending of his tariff regime by the Supreme Court, the global trading system has already been transformed in ways that don't necessarily favor the U.S., even if America's trade numbers and key partners remain relatively the same. Certainly, the U.S. as it stands is still at this point the biggest destination for global manufacturers. To what degree do you think the trade war changed that?
We just got the U.S.'s year-end trade balance figures. And if you look at the top 10 U.S. trading partners, they really didn't shift around all that much. China's share of trade fell quite a bit. It's been falling for a couple of years now as the tariffs take effect. But it's still Canada and Mexico at the top. A couple of European countries, South Korea, Japan are in the top 10. Nothing has really changed to a significant degree in a sort of like structural way. This is much more of a slow burn change in the global trading system than a sudden shock to the system. But we're heading into a new chapter now.
And I guess in some ways, the trade war has also caused this fundamental shift as well, right? In terms of certainly companies feeling that they can't rely just on the U.S. as the main dominant market. They've got to find other, customers in other parts of the world. Jenni, how has a country like China taken advantage of this asymmetry in global trade?
I think China's one of the best, most stark examples of just trade rerouting. You know, by the end of last year, China's exports to the US accounted just for 10% of its total exports. And that's half from the first trade war. And, you know, and you saw this surge in exports instead to Europe, Latin America, Africa. Exporters just found other markets. And then, you know, China finished the year with that $1.2 trillion trade surplus, which no one was expecting it would be able to record in a year where it's facing the highest US tariffs, you know, in nearly a century. So they proved that you can diversify and find other markets. And it's also then, you know, it's taken advantage of not only the trade war, but I think just the general volatility of Trump, right? Just sort of warm its relationships and warm its trade ties with other countries. You know, you saw Mark Carney come at the beginning of this year and talk about a new world order in China, striking a bunch of trade deals with Beijing, and then Beijing kind of, you know, handing out an olive branch by rolling back the tariffs that it had imposed on Canada. And then Canada saying, okay, right, you know, we're going to let in a certain quota of Chinese electric vehicles into Canada, which was something they had resisted to align with the US. That seemed like a landmark moment. And then you had Keir Starmer coming just very shortly afterwards and trying to achieve something similar. So I think China sees that other countries now need to diversify, and it's repositioning itself as sort of a land of opportunity at a time when people really are desperate for new growth drivers and are now willing to sort of overlook some of the different issues or the difficult issues that had sort of stopped them being so favorable to trade with Beijing, such as the war in Ukraine, human rights issues. People are now kind of, they're being more pragmatic because it's a more kind of dangerous world in terms of trade. Going into the trade war, economists were saying tariffs at 60% are going to like decimate the Chinese economy. No way they're going to sort of come out of this unscathed, quite stark economic predictions. None of that came to pass. You know, exports surged and they hit their growth target of about 5%. So it didn't really have a negative impact on China at all.
In some ways, I mean, that's a feather in China's cap, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the trade war went better for Xi Jinping than he probably ever realized it would do. And it probably has rewired trade. Like if those tariffs went away now, would companies start selling back into American markets? And maybe they would, and they'd have even more trade. You know, it's hard to predict.
Jenni, trade obviously goes hand in hand with geopolitical ties. How might the trade shifts affect political ties between the U.S. and its biggest trading partners?
I think it's already having an impact, right? Because it's this volatility. So US allies are realizing that the US is not as a reliable partner, not just in terms of sort of military spending, but in terms of trade as well. You know, you embrace Trump's trade war, you say, okay, we'll make the deals, we'll do the investment, we'll put in the hours. And then turns out they aren't legal after all. And then you have to sort of renegotiate and go back all over again. So I think it just dents US credibility. No one's going to turn their back on the US. It's too powerful. And it still is a huge military guarantor, particularly to countries like Japan in this region. But at the same time, there is a clear need to make sure you have a range of partners and all of your eggs are not just in one basket.
Now, President Trump is expected to meet President Xi at a summit in Beijing at the end of March. How does the Supreme Court ruling change the balance of power at the negotiating table when they meet?
This could be the sort of the first test, if you like real test of how the Supreme Court sort of changes some of these deals. It's hard to imagine Trump arriving with any less sort of swagger than he would do normally. And he knows that he has these sort of Section 301 investigations, so he could still threaten more tariffs. And with China, he's already got an investigation going where he could impose them. At the same time, one of the big deliverables, they were meant to extend the trade truce they have. And that's predicated, you know, China will keep supplying rare earths if America doesn't raise tariffs, if it keeps the tariffs down. Well, the tariffs are gone. So if you're China, you know, maybe you ask for something extra now to keep up your half of the deal. The only reason they were buying the soybeans from the US was, again, to get the tariffs down. Well, if the tariffs are not there anymore, it just gives Xi an opening to say, if I'm going to keep doing this for you, what are you going to do for me? And maybe Trump's answer to that is we'll go easy on you when it comes to some of these other sort of sectoral tariffs. But even if that is the answer, then that's a win for Xi, because before he didn't have that leverage. He would have had to find something different. So it will be interesting to see sort of how strongly the Chinese play their hand. On the other hand, I don't think they want to rock the boat too much. So maybe they just decide the status quo is a good thing. It's better to have a bird in the hand than two in the tree. And they keep sort of targeting that. But certainly she has more options now than he did a few weeks ago.
What would be the dream scenario for President Xi?
Xi Jinping has two things he really cares about getting from the US. It is access to the highest end NVIDIA chips, and it is some kind of concession on Taiwan. And I think if you're sat in Beijing thinking, what's the biggest thing I can get here? Is this my best moment? Then you're going to push. And Trump has already signaled that he's much more open to giving them those top chips than any other US leader or politician is. And then on Taiwan, they want stronger language around opposing Taiwan independence, which would be a big blow for Taiwan if that language changes. And they want Trump to stop selling Taiwan so many weapons.
So he could actually get what he wants.
He could.
Xi.
Yeah, good.
This is the Big Take Asia from Bloomberg News. I'm Oanh Ha. To get more from the Big Take and unlimited access to all of Bloomberg.com, subscribe today at Bloomberg.com/podcast offer. If you liked the episode, make sure to subscribe and review the Big Take Asia wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. Thanks for listening. See you next time.